The DNA is isolated in one vessel, and that is encased in another vessel to make sure that there are no other influences that are happening from outside to influence the DNA. They're saying that they are forced. They're not saying it looks like, or it appears, or this is what we found. They're saying we are forced to accept the possibility that some new field of energy is being excited by the DNA. What the scientists did was into the vessel that had completely random photons, they put human DNA. The experiment begins with something seemingly very innocent, a glass vessel, a vase, where all of the air has been completely drawn out of this vessel to create what we call a vacuum. So a vacuum implies that this vessel is empty, but we know it's not completely empty because there are still little photons of light that remain in this vessel. Scientists know this. So the question now is, where are those photons? They want to get a baseline and see where the photons are right now. So the first part of this experiment, they draw the air out of the vessel, and then they measure where these photons are in the vessel. Are they all piled up on the bottom? Or are they floating around the inside? Or are they all stuck to the edges? And what they found was no surprise. The vessel showed that these photons are completely random. They're completely random. By the way, these are the same kinds of photons, the particles of matter that make up the atom itself, that we described in the last episode. So we're dealing with these fundamental particles of the stuff that our world is made of, and that's important. So the scientists found that the distribution of the photons in this vessel was completely random. No surprise, that's what they expected. The next piece of this experiment is where, while the experiment is fascinating, what I find really fascinating is the thinking of the scientists that made the experiment possible. For a scientist trained in the scientific method, based upon all of those false assumptions that we saw earlier in this program, those assumptions of separation, for the scientists to move out of that box of thinking and begin asking new questions like, what if our assumptions are wrong? What would that tell us about our world? That's where it gets really interesting, and that's what the next part of this experiment is all about. Because what the scientists did was, into the vessel that had completely random photons, they put human DNA. Human DNA, because they wanted to see if human DNA has an effect on the photons. And before I go any further, I'm going to invite you to think about what they're asking. Photons are the stuff this world is made of. DNA is the stuff we're made of. And they're asking, scientists are asking in the laboratory, does the stuff we're made of have an effect on the stuff our world is made of? This is where it starts to sound like science fiction, or at least something that an advanced yogi would be working with. But these are in a bona fide scientific laboratory, these questions, this is where they're being asked. So here's what they did. They took human DNA and they placed it inside the vessel. And then they measured the DNA again to see what would happen. And they measured the photons again to see what would happen. And the results of this experiment changed the way we have been conditioned to think about ourselves and the world. Because the photons went from being completely random when they were first measured, and in the presence of the human DNA, the photons are no longer random, they are ordered. They followed precisely the geometry of the DNA. The DNA was having a direct effect on the photons. The stuff we're made of is having a direct effect on the stuff our world is made of. Just like some of our most ancient and cherished indigenous and spiritual traditions have always told us that we are connected to the world. So this is the first experiment. Human DNA has a measurable effect on the stuff our world is made of. Now I want you to see the way the scientists responded to this. So I'm going to read this to you directly. In the journal Nanobiology, it was published in 1995, the way the scientists described this, they said that the photons were described as behaving, and this is a quote, surprisingly and counterintuitively. Counterintuitively. It's counterintuitive because the scientific thinking is that everything is separate from everything else, and there is no stuff to convey any effect from the DNA to the matter. That's why it's counterintuitive to the science. But the next piece is what I find particularly interesting. I'm going to invite you to listen to the language. It says we are forced to accept the possibility. They're saying that they are forced. They're not saying it looks like, or it appears, or this is what we found. They're saying we are forced to accept the possibility that some new field of energy is being excited by the DNA. Well, I think we know it's not a new field. It's a field that's been around a long time. It's simply that we are just now recognizing that field and what it means to us. So the summary of this second experiment is that science now confirms that human DNA influences the stuff our world is made of through the photons by communicating directly through the field. That's a big piece. But now let me go to the second experiment. This experiment was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in 1994. It begins with human DNA once again, and this is a very precise kind of human DNA. It comes from umbilical cords of newborns because that DNA is what's called very pristine DNA. It hasn't been eroded over time, as happens as we mature in life. So it's a very pristine kind of DNA. And the DNA is isolated in one vessel, and that is encased in another vessel to make sure that there are no other influences that are happening from outside to influence the DNA. So here is the experiment. This very unique DNA is now placed within the range of the field of a human heart that we described in an earlier episode. Every human heart, if you recall, has a field of energy that extends beyond the physical heart for a distance between 5 to 8 feet. And that field, it is an electrical and a magnetic field that we can measure with conventional equipment. So the question is, through that field, is the DNA influenced by the emotions of another person? Can our emotions actually influence the DNA in our bodies? Before I tell you the experiment, let me just share a little bit about why this is important. Human DNA, when it is in our cells, it is coiled in very specific kinds of ways. And what scientists have found is that in the presence of certain emotions that we would call negative emotions, and I don't really like to use that term, but I'm going to use it to be clear on what we're talking about. So when we talk about emotions, for example, of anger or hate or jealousy or rage or frustration, those that we would typically consider as negative emotions, they have an effect on the DNA within our bodies. And the effect is that in the presence of those emotions, the DNA is actually, the coil is tightened. It's tightened like a little knot. And that's important because when it is tightened in this way, the DNA does not express to its fullest capacity. So the negative emotions tighten the coil and prevent the DNA from expressing the fullest capacity of whatever it is that it is expressing, whether it's our immune response or our anti-aging hormones or whatever it is. The DNA simply cannot do its full complement of what it's designed to do.
The stuff we're made out of doesn't even exist, and the world that we see doesn't exist the way we believe it does. What he said was what we see as matter is here because of the existence of what he called a conscious and intelligent mind, and these are his precise words. And he followed that statement by saying that underlying this mind is the matrix of all matter. And this is the coin he termed in 1944. Of course, the movie series was based on the studies that came afterward, but it's actually been around since the mid-20th century. So this field, the matrix, or the divine matrix as it now is being called, is recognized as the field of intelligent, non-conventional energy. It doesn't work the way electricity or broadcast energy works. And perhaps that's one of the reasons it's taken so long for science to catch up with the fact that this was there because our equipment isn't built to detect this kind of energy. On the one hand, the other hand, these ancient indigenous cultures, they detected it through the equipment of their bodies. They understood how to sense and feel and work and move in this field. So for me, I was trained as a scientist. And in my training, there was never an allowance for the possibility this field could exist. As a matter of fact, in the last 100 years, science has missed the mark twice in terms of their explanation, the story that science gives of how our world works. And we're now paying the price for where science got it wrong, essentially. And it's coming full circle, it's being corrected. But the first place that this happened was with the belief that the space between things is empty. And now we know that nothing could be further from the truth. There's a lot going on in what we always thought was empty space, but from the experiments that were performed in 1887, very famous Michelson-Morley experiments, to detect whether or not this field was there, when those experiments were interpreted as proving that the field wasn't there over 100 years ago, from that point forward, our science has been based in the belief that everything is separate from everything else. What happens in one place doesn't have any effect on anything else. And that what happens in this lifetime has nothing to do with any other lifetimes. And when we leave our bodies, there's nothing for our souls to travel into. And this is going to be important as we talk about some of the implications of our time in history and where we're going. So this is the first principle where they got it wrong. And the second was that science, Western science, has believed firmly that the experiences that we have inside of our bodies, our thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, our prayers, our affirmations, in here have no effect on the world beyond our bodies. And now we know that these two assumptions are flat wrong. There is something in the nothing, and we do have the ability through our hearts, what is called coherent heart-based emotion, to create the fields in our bodies, the fields of our beliefs, of our thought, feelings, and emotions that extend beyond our bodies into the divine matrix. So when people ask, what is the divine matrix? The way to answer that, it is the container for the entire universe. As far as scientists understand right now, everything that happens in this universe and in the higher dimensions of this universe are all within the context of this field, number one. Number two, that the divine matrix is a bridge between our inner and our outer worlds. It's the conduit that allows our prayers and our good wishes for one another to move from our hearts into this field and be disseminated and distributed in the field in ways that we're only beginning to understand, in ways that appear to defy the laws of physics as we understand them today. And that's exciting. And number three, this field appears to be a mirror in that the quantum soup of all possibilities, if you will, that exists as this field.
A new school of thought suggests that consciousness informs itself through its creations, through its art, music, books, and movies. With this idea in mind, when we look at the themes of some of the most popular movies of our time, what are those movies telling us about ourselves? If consciousness is informing us of something that we need to know about ourselves through the things that we create to remind ourselves of ourselves, what are those films telling us? Well, examples include hugely popular movies like The Matrix, for example, or Avatar, or the movie Inception. What are films like these saying to us? What part of our reality are they reminding us of? Well, if we look at the common themes, they'll give us a clue. As different as they are from one another, each of these movies is suggesting, number one, that there is a world that exists we simply cannot see from our limited perspective. But this world influences our everyday lives. Number two, we're told that we're limited in our lives only until we wake up to the parameters of this unseen world. Number three, they're telling us that everyone has the ability to do just that, to wake up and to transcend the limits of their lives that begin with the events in the world that we can't even see. The success of a recent movie, the 2017 movie Arrival, is another beautiful example of what I mean here. And it opens the door to precisely what I want to talk about in this episode. The theme of The Arrival is so powerful, maybe one of the most powerful, underrated, and perhaps hopeful messages seen in modern times. Because beyond the theme of the ETs and of the conflict and UFOs and the special effects, what the movie is saying to us is that there's a message, and the message is very, very simple. The message says that the language that we use in our everyday lives determines the way our brain connects the neurons, and in turn, the way that we think and even what we think about.